And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. What a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas from already tonight. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I wear my sunglasses at night.
Mhm.
Don't mess around with a guy in shades, especially with all those X flares. You're going to need some kind of glasses going on. And this whole X flare sunspot activity, and everyone's going over a cliff with it, but they are kind of an interesting science unto themselves. And the mystery schools have quite a few interesting things to say about them, including one Casey reading that gets into the origins of such things, and he ties it into the Tower of Babel. If you can take the literal thing and the metaphor together and roll them together. But it's great to be here with you, so many of you there in the ideas room tonight. This is going to be a very important episode because we're going to go with you about 90 minutes tonight. And this is all about the documentary Hacking Atlantis, the Craze in the HotZone. So what I did there was I took all my latest research around Atlantis in the Bahamas area, along with this whole theme about the HotZone, which we've presented on this program for a good while. I think there's over 20 some odd episodes of the HotZone. And what it has to do with is Atlantis in the Bahamas. So that's Bimini, and this whole area actually of the HotZone stretches out to the western tip of Cuba, all the way over to the Yucatan Peninsula. And we found people on the political side. We found geopolitical intrigues. We found archaeology. We found celebrities. This is a dramatic story that involves everyone from Ernest Hemingway to Ghislaine Maxwell to Edgar Cayce and Rudolf Steiner. And it's all centered in this very interesting area, which according to Cayce was rising. And therefore, the ruins associated with it were also becoming visible. This is something which has intrigued me for a long time. And the HotZone came about because I had spoken to a number of people who were giving me intel about having done things for energy companies or in the military or whatever. And when they were in that area, they were told, here's your little NDA. If you see anything like, ruins, you see the Temple of Isis down there or a Great Pyramid lookalike, you can't say anything about it. There's no press conference or anything like that. You tell us, and that's it. You're under orders. And a number of people started to come forward and give me this whole information. And this area has assumed a couple of different names, but the HotZone is the one that really seemed to stand out for me. So that's why I call it the HotZone. And down there in the HotZone, we can see a number of intrigues. One of them went public, which I covered in the documentary. And I should say the documentary is Hacking Atlantis. This is part of a series, but this is a very important one, about 90 minutes. And I've made it free for all the people there on YouTube and also at our website, etc. This is Hacking Atlantis, the Craze in the HotZone. And the figures there, you're pretty good if you can name them off. But if you've been watching this show, you can see everyone from Thomas Townsend Brown to Ernest Hemingway to Plato and Helena Blavatsky and others there right up in the front. And what you have here is all of these people and all of these stories and rich traditions all pointing to this central area right there in the HotZone, relating to this ancient culture. This is not just the idea of an archaeology that is, looking at the age of things, although the age is quite dramatic here because Cayce is placing Atlantis as far back as 200,000 BC. And its, submersion, we're finding Cayce's listing around 10,500 BC. It's very interesting. Some of the earliest theosophical literature, I went back, was Scott Elliott's work from 1894 on Atlantis. And I highlight that a little bit tonight here as well, because this contains a date which I thought was interesting because it's a very early mystery school dating of Atlantis. You have some things that are happening around the 1870s and 1880s with theosophy, but this level of dating shows up in 1894, and it is the main continent of Atlantis was destroyed in a period about 800,000 years ago. The second great catastrophe, 200,000 years ago. The third great catastrophe, about 80,000 years ago. And the final submergence of Poseidonus. Now, I want to say this. This Poseidonus is very much like what Casey calls Poseidia. And this is that area around Bimini where the kingdom of Alta was. And this was the kind of main point for the Emilius group, who were the more, shall we say, benevolent. And the Sons of Belial are the warlike group, adopting the same technology that the Emilius group is using for this spiritual communion and using it to nuke their neighbors, as it were. Now, he has this Poseidonus going down 9,564 BC. Now, that's a very specific kind of year, and it's very interesting because as much as we've heard about Atlantis going down in these different periods, it seems like there's a period where most of Atlantis is down, but there's still this corridor left, and that is the corridor between Bimini and the Yucatan. And then when that goes, the remnants of that are what Paulina Zalitsky discovered in 2001 off the coast of Cuba. And we get into that in the documentary. I'm going to get into it tonight. But what's interesting about this date is if you go back into Plato's story from Solon, he's giving the date 9,000 years before when he's writing. Now he's writing there about 400, 450 BC. So he's giving a date that's very similar to this. So there's a very solid foundation for the dating back there. And what happened, one of the big clashes between, say, mystical archaeology, the psychic archaeology of Edgar Cayce, and the traditional gods of archaeology and their dating systems, was that, you know, they were saying, well, the Great Pyramids were built at 2500 BC, and Casey's got this coming in at 10,500 BC, these 8,000 years in between. You know, we don't have any culture for that. Sorry, here's our version. And their version, incidentally, adopted heavily, basically in the 18th century. So, you know, 200 or 300 years later, maybe they could update that entire thing. But the dating becomes very interesting, especially when Casey goes into it. He talks about how it was set up already by the Atlanteans coming into Egypt as archaeology. So the Giza Plateau, older, they were doing archaeology on it in 10,500 BC. So how far does that plateau go back? This is part of the whole HotZone mystery, as it was Poseidia, the group from Poseidia that was fleeing into Egypt. And they were the Emilius group, and they brought what Casey refers to as the information for the Twoy stone. And so all this figures into our HotZone play tonight. I am going to do a few updates tonight on what's going on in the political world, as well as all the craziness that we're seeing. But before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Okay. Jessica Rodriguez says, anti-gravity in the ancient Akashic Records is going to be a good topic tonight. I always love these episodes that have to do with ancient technology and modern reality. We know that they've had anti-gravity since the late 40s, early 50s. That's how they got all the military industrial complex UFOs to fly.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, I would actually say that they had it a lot earlier. Even in the modern rediscovery, you know, I'd go back even a couple hundred years. So, but certainly I think the 40s are a good place to start to spotlight it. One of the things that we did with the HotZone documentary is when I went into it, I found the key people who were discovering things, and they had the perfect cover for, you know, exploring this technological research of Atlantis while not being sort of detected, the stuff not coming out. Because a few people have said to me, you know, if Hemingway was working on it, you know, wouldn't a bunch of people be like after him on this? Wouldn't it have leaked out somehow? And the answer is no. One, because Hemingway was fantastic about keeping intelligence. And this is a crucial piece, which is the Central Intelligence Agency cracked down on him because he had his own intelligence network. And I've pointed out that he actually was afraid in his bio. there, if you go through it, you're going to find that his son, Jack, who is the father of Mariel and Margot Hemingway, the late Margot, with all of the strange family stories around there that came out. But he was a CIA agent, and Hemingway was very afraid of him because of his CIA connections. And so Hemingway is kind of, on the hunt, on the run from his own son. It's a very strange piece, but this is the kind of thing that the CIA does to break people down. And a lot of the suicides that we see around the Hemingway story may not be what they appear to be. I go into great detail in what I think is one of the largest revelations in the documentary. And I've linked the documentary, by the way, in the description of this video. And it's there for you, and it's free because I want everyone out there to really get the picture on what is going on here. And we have plans of bringing that HotZone information, more and more of it out. But one of the really, I think, important things for us to consider about Hemingway is that his mother has a Grace. Grace Hemingway is this incredible woman, society woman there in Oak Park, Illinois, and she is part, musical theater and all these wonderful things. She's an actress very early on, and she's very close with Edgar Cayce, and Casey's doing readings for her, and finally Cayce is doing readings about Ernest. Now, this is left out, and it's something that we were able to put on the map in relation to Ernest Hemingway, because Ernest Hemingway shows up exactly where Cayce says Poseidia is going to rise, the temple of Poseidia, and all of that hall of records, because remember, there's 3 of them that the Atlanteans left. By the way, as I'm going through the Cayce readings, I'm discovering that as many times as he mentioned hall of records, it's pyramid of records that he refers to again and again, still undiscovered. He's very clear that we have not discovered it yet by that point, by the time he died, say in 1945. So when we're looking at the relationship between Grace and Edgar, and then we have Hemingway living there, basically in the HotZone. He spends the rest of his life basically in between Bimini and Cuba, and at the end of his life, he goes to Idaho, but he's there 25 years in Bimini and Cuba. And where did all this come from? Well, he loved fishing. Okay, well, there's a lot of different options if you love fishing. Bimini in particular is obscure, very obscure location. But when you start to connect those dots between Hemingway's mother and the readings on Bimini, then it all starts to become very clear. By the way, there's a very interesting reading about Hemingway's mother being an associate of Raphael, the great painter, and that she, had been reincarnated, and, she was back, and she had this incredible artistic ability. And so we see some really remarkable things there. What's fascinating is if you go into Cayce's work and Rudolf Steiner's work, you're going to have them both identifying Raphael as a reincarnation of John the Baptist. So we have a lot there going on when you're dealing with Grace Hemingway, and then that filters down to Ernest. But let's talk about Lester Hemingway, shall we?
Before we do that,
yeah.
Najat Madre has a question. Is it possible Hemingway was an agent for another agency, possibly for another country?
Well, this is what the CIA tried to stick on him. But considering all the missions that he did for OSS, for this country, all the undercover stuff that he did as a volunteer when he was this, fantastically wealthy, successful, legendary writer. No, I think what he was definitely hardcore, true blue American. But I think the intelligence networks that he was associated with are associated directly with this archaeological aspect. And there are also some weird things that I uncovered related to Hemingway that I'm going to bring out further, including his association with James Forrestal, and also a very interesting conversation he had with a journalist about how he felt that they had done Forrestal in. So we're going to get into some heavy things here tonight. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Atlantean anti-gravity. And yes, Thomas Townsend Brown is in there on the anti-gravity part. And Akashic Records. This is a very important concept brought forward deep, deep in the mystery schools, and is most common in kind of Indian literature and Eastern literature. However, in the Western esoteric tradition, it has a lot of broad support as well, and brought forward very heavily at the end of the 19th century as a platform to give us some information. And I have some key quotes tonight about the Akashic Record. And also, in one of the readings, or one of the kind of lectures that Rudolf Steiner, the founder of anthroposophy, gives, anyone in the ideas room knows a great deal about Rudolf Steiner, but if you don't, there's a number of shows we've done on him. And I think he really left an incredible legacy when we get into these questions in particular. But one of the things that he said was that those mystery schools in Egypt, they didn't size people up so much by meeting them and having them go through tests. They could size them up based on their previous lives and previous incarnations. This is very interesting because it goes into another piece of information about Helena Blavatsky that we have, that the mystery schools, when she was born, knew who she was and tracked her from birth. So there's some kind of scheduling, shall we say, that goes on behind the scenes. And this is all really quite incredible. So this is kind of a special report on the documentary, Hacking Atlantis, the Craze and the HotZone, as I mentioned. And this is a powerful 90-minute documentary available to you on this channel. And it really brings together characters like John Lennon and Ghislaine Maxwell and Gordon Cooper and Rata and Plato and Helena Blavatsky. And what we come to realize is the idea, or the odds of all these people just kind of haphazardly wandering into the hot zone and being associated with Atlantis, or the psychic readings of Edgar Cayce, or other branches of mystery information, is just, phenomenal and off the charts. There's something very heavy going on there in the hot zone, and that accounts for a lot of the geopolitical tensions that happen there as well. And we're going to get into that tonight. I want to remind you, before we get fully on into everything, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch, and with all the incredible censorship that we've suffered, including this documentary, which, by the way, took 3 different tries to get it up there, because it kept getting flagged for one nonsense reason or another. So the best way to make sure that you are on track with us there is just go to darkjournalist.com, sign up for that newsletter. It takes about 30 seconds, and it lets you know about the incredible events that we have coming up, documentaries, X-series episodes that will blow your mind, including a 2-parter on Helena Blavatsky coming up later this month, and the enormously, you won't believe it, and we're trying as much as possible to do the coverage around the 2024 election, which I think is very important. So before I jump into the rest of this, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Well, this is the first question we got, which is from Lisa Whaler. Why do they almost worship the original copy of Alice in Wonderland? None your business says the original copy might have had hidden messages in it. The writer was a genius mathematician. Rotten Cryptobit says the original copy of Alice was in the hands of conjurers. Power lingers if you are a conjurer.
Oh, yeah. Well, the story goes back to Thomas Townsend Brown and that very unusual Caroline yacht. And this name Caroline floats through a number of things, including the close association behind the scenes of Hemingway and JFK. And along with the fact that, Caroline Kennedy, there's that name showing up there again. And, Mariel Hemingway, that's a port there in Cuba. There's a lot of crisscross with Hemingway and JFK around Cuba, and it literally is off the charts. This Alice in Wonderland piece, we've done a number of episodes on Alice in Wonderland, and also the Rosicrucian influence around this. But what's interesting is that when Thomas Townsend Brown, I have some interesting quotes on Brown, and Brown, of course, part of that Byfield-Brown team that in his 20s brought together this whole magnetic working theory, and absolutely fascinating black project scientist, I guess you could say. And this is somebody who started the major UFO groups in the 50s as well, was committed to bringing that subject out. And what happens to him is after he comes out with the whole Byfield-Brown effect, the Navy wants him really badly. And they do a lot of different things to recruit him. So they get him to go to Cuba. And when he shows up in Cuba, they have this special mission for him. But the day that he gets there, a massive earthquake hits Cuba. And that's the first weird sign of what he's doing down there. The next is that he's going to test a submersible that has never been tested off the western tip of Cuba. You might take note that later on, Polina Zalitsky will find an incredible metropolis under the water there off the western tip of Cuba. And just keep that in mind as we go along here tonight. But Thomas Townsend Brown tells the story of them saying, before you do your mission, you're going to have a very interesting meeting with this gentleman who's hanging out on this yacht called the Caroline off the coast of Cuba. You go ahead and do that, and he'll tell you what needs to happen. And the way Brown describes the meeting is, it's just kind of awkward. And but when he goes there, he's walking around on this guy's yacht, and out of the blue, the yacht owner comes over to him with the original copy of Alice in Wonderland in glass and tells him, this is the original copy. And he's sort of looking at him for any reaction. And then Brown says, well, why do you have this thing, just hanging out here in glass? Is this just to protect it? And, and he says, well, if the yacht goes down, the copy survives. I went into this a little bit and found that original copy made its way into Calvin Coolidge's White House, where Calvin Coolidge wanted to look at a copy of this thing. So, and some of the original...
Man, that makes you want to research Calvin Coolidge. What was he into?
Indeed. Well, a lot of his history is right over here in Western Mass,
okay.
Not, a couple hours out, not too far. And really, if you think about it, Calvin Coolidge is the 20s president, not talked about very much. He's before our friend Roosevelt, but after our friend Wilson, and he's just right there in that corridor. Very unusual guy. And I believe the last bachelor in the White House. We can double check that. But this is very interesting. There is a kind of a theme there with the original copy. And the fact that they're using this as a test for T.T. Brown, or at least planting these seeds in his mind early on, are interesting. The secret submersible, he never talks about later, but he does talk about having been there for a submersible. Now, I do have information about T.T. Brown that you can't get in books, because I talked to members of his family at length and associates. Now, there are some good books out about T.T. Brown, but I will say that his daughter cautioned me in relation to some of the books that are out there, especially the ones that like to focus on her kind of love affair with her dad's assistant and things like that. She felt that either there was a marketing angle, or the people, the authors involved who were trying to bring the story out, may have been associated with intelligence. Now, I do think it's interesting that the angle of information that we've brought forward on Brown has been, imitated, shall we say. And there's distortion about T.T. Brown. One of the things that his daughter told me, which I found fascinating, was that he felt he was in connection with some type of race that was beyond Earth. And so aliens, quote unquote, but he felt like he was associated with this. And that whoever he was interacting with, and this included that they had these craft and things, they had given him something that looked like kind of a larger version of the iPhone. And that upon his deathbed, a number of people involved around American intelligence were pressuring him because they wanted this thing that he had. And so, when he's on his deathbed and he's talking to her, they have this whole kind of back and forth. He's pointing out individuals and saying, never let them near any of my stuff, and they're all people from like the intelligence world. So for me, and there's a lot of stories about him that the daughter tells in terms of the Acoustic Fan, and we tell the story in the documentary about the Acoustic Fan. A lot of people may not be aware that T.T. Brown, when he was in his kind of prep school, private college phase, he had a very unusual psychic mystical experience. And what happened was, and that's the same school, prep school that Donald Trump went to, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe there's something in the water there. But while he's there, he sees an orb, and he used to take his horse over by this lake there, and he has these pictures of the horse and the lake and all this stuff. And while he's there, this orb comes over the water, sits there, and then comes at him at high speed, and the horse jumps and all this kind of stuff. He finds himself unconscious, lying on the ground. And when he wakes up, he can see not only his entire life that he's lived, but the entire life he will live. And there's a kind of a message to it about what he's going to bring knowledge to humanity, this type of thing. So he's very freaked out about this, but it guides a lot of his silly battles with conscience, shall we say, of dealing in these kind of very, very experimental projects and what the government and the military might do with them. So I would say the Brown aspect in the documentary is very powerful. And it's interesting because there is a quote in his biography when they're talking about how he had worked early on with these Coolidge tubes. And it says, Brown mounted the Coolidge tube in a careful balance as if it were an astronomical telescope. His idea was to point the tube in different directions and somehow find a variation in the power used by the tube. And the strength of the X-rays generated. He didn't want what he was looking for, no matter where he aimed his apparatus. He didn't find what he was looking for. No telltale differences appeared, but he did find something he wasn't looking for. He found that the X-ray tube generated a thrust as if it wanted to move. Now, this is very interesting and was kept as a heavy secret around the technological edge of this. I will note that John Trump works exactly in that very same corridor around X-ray tubes, and eventually would go to space microwave communications with his very unusual work, extrapolating work from Van de Graaff, who was working off of Tesla coils and things like that. And we know what we've put forward about John Trump in relation not only to Nikola Tesla, but the UFO file and Vannevar Bush. But this is interesting because if very early on Thomas Townsend Brown were into something, and he gets associated with things as far-flung as the Philadelphia experiment to actually being involved with creating anti-gravity flying saucers. The thing that I found most interesting in my conversations with his family was that he would go every year to San Antonio, and they thought he was going to Cuba with his friend Robert Sarbarker, who we know is the physicist that was wiped out of history for talking about the UFO file a little too loosely at the end of his life, unfortunately. And that's a guy who, when we think of the movies that came out about Oppenheimer, for example, this is a guy who was right up at that level and, was featured in all the major magazines and things. They really scrubbed him from history because of his conversations. And I think what he said is very significant, which is, yes, we had a UFO program. And yes, we studied the beings that were part of the crashes, and we decided somebody had made them, and they had made them like insects to absorb the fast changes and things that the craft would make. That's pretty hardcore for a physicist of that ilk to make those. But he's best friends for years through World War II and everything else with Thomas Townsend Brown. And they go away together once a month to Cuba before the revolution. And the family always thought, he's going to Texas and, getting time off or whatever. After he dies, they discover that he is actually going to San Antonio, Cuba. So this is highly significant because they didn't know anything about it. Now, if you look at this Cabo San Antonio, which is where he was going, this is the very western tip of Cuba. And it's exactly where Zalitsky's jump-off point to find the Atlantean underwater metropolis was. So T.T. Brown was probably there studying that exact same underwater metropolis that Zalitsky would trip into some 40 years later or 50 years later. Quite remarkable, and it shows a gigantic program around the western tip of Cuba relating to these underwater Atlantean ruins. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew, this is great. It's going to be a short report tonight, but we're going deep with you on this Atlantean anti-gravity and Akashic Records. How the mystery school is involved with this, you're going to find out tonight. We're going to be taking your questions, I want to mention, in the second half of tonight's program. You can give those to Miss Olivia now, all in caps, and she's going to put them together, and we'll run through all of those in the second half of the program. Before I go any further, you're up.
Okay, David Termina very excitedly says,
Yeah.
DJ, I came across a passage from Casey on a blog. It mentioned that E.R. Johnson carried away the Firestone from a Caribbean expedition. Can you confirm that? Wouldn't that be Eldridge Johnson? Also, isn't it quite a coincidence that the naval vessel said to be used in the Philadelphia experiment was the USS Eldridge?
Fascinating indeed. Well, you always find great stuff. And the things around this HotZone piece, what happened, if you go into the thing about the Firestones, is that Casey had identified an archaeologist who was in Yucatan, so not in the Caribbean. So if you have something with him in the Caribbean, I would want to hear about it. But what he says in 1933 is that there is an expedition going on, and it's in the Yucatan, and that they are finding emblems of the Firestone, and they're shipping them to Pennsylvania State. This became a big thing because it was Pennsylvania State Museum or the University of Pennsylvania, and both had major programs around archaeology. But it became confusing hunting it down. But then he gave specific names of who was operating the archaeological digs. So what's interesting is he did also mention, after he mentioned this thing about emblems, he said the Firestones are very much like those that they're running across that they know so little about in this expedition. So we have the emblems, the large pictures of this thing going off to the Pennsylvania museums, and then the stones that they know so little about that he talked about that had magnetized influence. Well, they are miniature versions of the larger Firestone, which is the Twoy stone. The Twoy stone is a massive power network, exactly like how we have our electrical grid now, and just way more sophisticated, way more advanced. And it was a worldwide grid that quite possibly is associated with all the major monolithic sites that we see. But the way that Casey describes it is that it was used for every convenience. It was used for not only, flying above water and underwater, but also through things. For example, you're flying through mountains. Well, what kind of apotheum is going on there? So when you get into the Twoy stone, it's entirely unrealized research that's been sitting there that we've been trying to open up, that sits there in that Casey info, and it's just sitting there. It's some large scale message that has not been connected up with all the findings around Atlantis. But once we do those things, we have to also realize that Casey said, well, the whole thing about the construction of same is in that secret pyramid hall of records that's undiscovered in Egypt. Well, that would make it a very hot item, and why we might see all that level of secrecy. But whenever you get around the HotZone ruins and the crystal, this is very, very hardcore. And so, yeah, so we'll follow up on that one. But whoa, this is pretty wild.
Okay, 1 second.
Yeah.
David follows up. I can confirm that Fenimore Johnson, ER's son, made a whole career out of underwater photography.
Oh, wow. Okay. Well, that is very significant. I want to mention something here. And, I've mentioned that JFK, you've seen the episodes where we've looped in the JFK aspect. And the reason that I can draw that in legitimately is not just because I'm such a fan of JFK and done so much research on him. No, he's right in the heart of this HotZone story through Hemingway. And it's quite interesting because we've told the story before that if you go into the Kennedy Library now, the largest repository of Ernest Hemingway material, books, poems, letters, his entire life sits there at the Kennedy Library. There's no Ernest Hemingway museum that rivals anything like that. The largest amount of information is there. And then you go back to yourself and you say, why? Well, if you go into those HotZone episodes, you get an idea through Mary Hemingway, his widow, who went to him and said, everything that he was working on was in the vault there at Finca Bahia, his large villa on the water. And the stories go back when we get around Hemingway of him traveling around Cuba and just going back and forth on this boat. Now, the boat is suited up with all this scientific equipment. And when they would ask him, what are you doing going back and forth? It's only so much fishing you can do. And he said, oh, I'm looking for German U-boats. This cover story is one of the worst cover stories in history. There's no weapons on this boat. And so, if you see a German U-boat under there, you can't do anything, but they can blow you up. So that story never washed. But if you go just a millimeter deep in this story, you're going to find his brother is working as a newspaper man. And what is he doing? He's in submarines there in the same HotZone. He's down there. Well, later he founds New Atlantis, as we know, but it was because he spotted ruins off of the western tip of Cuba. So this is very important. The other thing is, when I went deep into JFK's military record, I decided to really check out where he was, because I was overlaying his record with what I knew about Hemingway's mission for the OSS. And it is very interesting, because what you find is JFK in this 1943 period, what he's doing is he is running the entire division about chasing submarines off of Florida, right off the coast there. So he has that whole access as well. So everywhere we get around this story, underwater photography, Gordon Cooper doing missions for JFK, taking pictures of the HotZone from above, it all comes down to something that's going on there in the Bahamas. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Special Report. This is Atlantean Anti-Gravity and Akashic Records. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of the program. And I want to mention, of course, you can ask those questions now. Miss Olivia is putting those together. Also, if you're new here, make sure you go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch with each other through the incredible censorship that we've been seeing. And I see it happen as well to other kind of, major accounts. And the types of things that they're trying to keep down. There's also the promotion, and it gets really out of hand, of this layer of what's supposed to be independent media. And they're trying to replace that. And even some of that can be good, but it's very diluted stuff. So I think in terms of getting very potent information, these are the types of sources where we try to deliver things with no filter. It's not bought, and all the rest of it. One of the things I want to point out, and it's nothing personal about Candace Owens, But I ran across this program where they were saying, oh, you can meet this independent media personality, and they had a number of categories of doing this. And any way that an independent media person can make a living is fine with me. But they were asking for $5,000 a minute, and the minimum was 15 minutes. And I've been seeing a lot of this weird thing. It is the superstructure marketing corridor invading independent media and twisting it, because the mainstream media has collapsed to such a degree. So now we have a little bit of a problem going on, which is a lot of the independent media is getting swamped with the astroturfed junk. And things like Netflix are coming out and doing, like I said, the Castlero thing, and including some real information and a lot of faction, as they call it. Their fiction mixed with these stories. So I call that all kind of counterfeit conspiracy or junk
It's
conspiracy.
just another form of corruption.
It is. Yeah, it's inevitable to a certain degree, but I think being aware of it's important because, from time to time, I'm going to give you the best story about this, and it involves plagiarism. So last fall, I did a story about this baron in Africa, and he actually was very closely associated with the person who owned the Texas School Book Depository, who was D.H. Bird. And he had come to visit Bird, and then there was this whole thing about, did he actually leave, or was he the person who scouted out the assassination? And so I found pictures from the Baron's nephew, and I posted them, and they were all about, showing him with a rifle and these dates and things like that. And I came up with a whole thing about the Baron and his relationship with Bird and all the rest of it, which I think is crucial when you get around the Kennedy assassination. The Antarctica Bird aspect is something we've been front and center with. So, and I, understanding there's a number of theories about it, I get that, but I think this really has some backup to it. So this guy writes an article, and it comes out in one of those major publications about this, and he takes the entire presentation that I gave. He brings the whole thing out, all about the Baron and all the rest. He even uses the pictures that I had just done the episode with. You might remember this quite well. Well, that was one kind of a weird thing. I thought, well, that's pretty open plagiarism, but there you go. This guy writes to me, and then he says, oh, I've been following your Baron thing, whatever. And then he gives me a series of quiz questions that he wants me to answer so he can work on the next article. So my response basically was, well, if you credit me for the first one, then maybe I'll help you with the other thing. But otherwise, this is kind of crazy, stuff. But this is what goes on. And I see it go on with my work. I see it's for sure goes on with Gigi Young's work. It is, this kind of impersonation. So, I don't I don't take too much of an attitude toward it. We have to be aware of what's going on here, which is, these people are vacuum cleaners for ideas, and you have to know where things come from, and where the potent information is versus the kind of counterfeit stuff. And I would say that goes across the board. But there's a lot of money. Think about that $5,000 a minute thing.
Crazy.
So, when you get around this field, remember they pumped $50 million from the Intel thing. Who the hell knows where the money for TTSA came from? But that whole phony to the Stars Academy, $50 million, right? So somebody is jury rigging the field that we're dealing with. And, if I were to get really into it, I would also mention that our friend David Grush there, the UFO whistleblower, who, I've spoken to, and we went through this whole thing about Christopher Mellon controlling him. Well, an interesting thing came out about him recently, which is that despite his protestations to the contrary, this whole thing was that, Arrow, this group, who's the UFO Defense Office, and I don't trust them for anything. But his whole thing was, oh, they never wanted to talk to me. I tried to talk to them, but it never happened. And a number of things came out through these FOIAs, and I think it's a black vault. who did it, and because John is always John Greenwald, who runs the Black Vault, gets a lot of these good details. And there's tons of requests there for them. Say there's even a thing where he sets up a meeting to meet them and then doesn't show up. He leaves this guy in a hallway or whatever. So whatever they've done, and it's not just Grush, don't get me wrong, but the whole control of the thing, which comes from part of the superstructure, and certainly the Chris Mellon types are involved with this. That's the CIA false disclosure aspect. We cannot fall for that or allow people to get caught up in those types of things without at least knowing what the facts are involved. And certainly the facts in that case are that Christopher Mellon, the billionaire DOD official, controls Grush. And, that was very blatant from my conversation with him. And that was a shock to me. And then we know the flip out afterwards that Mellon had. It's classic history here on the X series. But it gets back to the thing, which is after the fact, what happens? The paperwork comes out and it shows these people aren't, they're working from this intel and marketing superstructure. You have to get a handle on that. And it's a better way to look at the whole field, I would say, because the potent stuff always holds up. And I hope that's what we're doing here. This lone outpost. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show deep tonight into Atlantean anti-gravity and Akashic Records. This is just a special report to cover our documentary. And I'll tell you, that is the documentary Hacking Atlantis, the Craze and the HotZone. All the characters are there. And that's about a 90-minute documentary and free and available for everyone in the public. And I hope that it opens up a lot of conversations. And, people are fine to plagiarize on it. Just make sure you give it footnoted and give it credit. There's no problem with that. It used to be the standard. What happened? I wanted to bring this up, and then we'll dive right back in to the mystery technology. And before I go any further, what do you got?
David Tormina said one more thing.
Oh, yeah.
He said, and let's not forget that Hemingway was a regular passenger on the Caroline yacht and even rendezvoused with Fenimore while supposedly stranded deep in the Florida Keys.
Well, part of that network there, it is the HotZone network going on, and it's largely unknown, except you can find these little pinpoints of connections.
By the way, a lot of people in the chat were saying that he was linked with British intelligence and in particular Welsh.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think that he was the kind of guy who could get, because of his status, could get a lot of different types of intel. But I do feel like he was kind of almost like a mad dog patriot in a lot of ways. And that's why he was always willing to rush to the front lines, blow me up first. Hemingway was not somebody who shied away from fighting on behalf of America. The question is, he didn't trust the intelligence agencies. So this becomes important because he did a number of missions for them and briefed them. He briefed the ONI. I have records of that. But after working with them, and then the CIA shows up after World War II, he becomes very suspicious, and they have files and files on him. And then they're like, oh, he's operating this thing called I think it's the Crooks Network or something, and they're like, oh, he's like a rival agency of his own down there in Cuba. We got to keep an eye on him. And I think there's coverage there. I think the Kennedys are providing coverage so that they don't give him too much trouble. There's a document that came out, of course, I've cited this in 2014, which was all about JFK meeting with Ed Lansdale and Robert Kennedy and the head of the CIA, who was McCone at the time, and talking about a national security incident inside of Finca Vigía, which is Hemingway's villa there in Cuba. And this is interesting because this is after he left. So Hemingway is already out of Cuba. So there's something there. There's that vault. And what happens is, if you go later, they ask the historians who were still around, who were Kennedy, acolytes, and they say, we never heard of any plans for a national security incident in Hemingway's villa. You don't know what that is. Well, if we tracked it back very heavily, and it all has to do with, in my opinion, the footage, the reports, and what he was able to obtain about the HotZone while he was there, and that when he had to flee because of the revolution, that was all left behind there. That's why Kennedy risked a national security incident, not to get Ernest Hemingway's poetry, which is wonderful prose and poetry, but it's not the kind of thing that Kennedy would risk for that. But the HotZone information for sure is. Speaking of Kennedy, I wanted to point this out. Here's my little section, which is free advice to the Bobby Kennedy campaign for president, independent, which I think started with high hopes and a lot of the wrong people, or people that were just too marketing oriented. Sometimes you need to, when you are in a presidential race, separate the candidate from the campaign. I've made this point, and I think it's important because I think Bobby's a very good candidate. And we've had him on the program and things, and I think that he has a lot to offer. But unfortunately, because of the campaign and the way that it's come in, I think that people are using it as a wedge rather than what it should be, which is, having a legitimate run at the presidency for these good issues that Bobby knows a lot about. But a lot of that campaign has been run on, shall we say, it's almost like a Zoom campaign in a lot of ways. It's not an on the ground, I'm going to win this election, I'm going to talk to the people campaign. It's a lot of like, heavy on the podcast stuff and not heavy on the ground enough. So recently, there's been a lot of screw ups because they've had him in public too much. And so he was on this one program and he gave an opinion about abortion, which was exactly the opposite of what Nicole Shanahan, his VP, thought. And so then she's on the same program where she's like, I didn't know he had that position, so there's all kinds of weirdness there. And when you have a VP, they should know what your position is. But what bothered me is the kind of what I call the Aspen aspect of this candidacy, which is that there's too much of him showing up in the kind of affluent environment. And I went back to JFK's campaign in 1960. And one of the things he had to do was win West Virginia, which nobody said he could do. And Kennedy went into where the coal miners worked, and he spent lots of time there that nobody had ever, as a candidate, gone in and spent time talking to these guys. And there's a lot of things that Kennedy knew about relating to people, that you had to know them, you had to go there, you had to talk to them, you had to understand what their problems were. And when they did that, supposedly West Virginia was supposed to be anti-Catholic or whatever. And Kennedy went in at one point, he's spending all this time, he starts to enjoy spending all this time with these coal miners, railroad workers, and all the rest. He's going in and spending more time than the campaign had planned. And when he gets into these conversations, they keep him for hours and hours. At one point, they have a lot of pictures of him sitting down on these rails, and supposedly his back is in absolute agony, but he's spending the time there with those people and getting that information and getting that background. This is the kind of thing that the Bobby Kennedy, if they're serious, would need to be good at, which is going into the heart. There's so many people that are unemployed or suffering under the Biden regime, and Bobby's not going into those places. There's too much of the whole Aspen vibe in Hollywood.
I do not want to see my candidate skiing. I'm sorry.
No, definitely not. And Bobby doesn't need to do that. He should be a man of the people. The policies are supposed to be about that. And I think that he is more about that. But the campaign is all about, hey, he's a rock star. And so I think that's the absolute death knell for the thing, unless, starting tomorrow, they turn it around and announce, we're going into this, here's our 26 city tour, and we're going into the hardest hit areas. We're going to talk to these people and see what's on their mind. That's what you need to do. And just, lay back on the fundraising and the tons of appearances and get in there and talk and lay out about 5 major points that you want to change for the country. I think we, as a campaign, we've heard enough about the candidate and the 12-step programs and stuff. And, let's get into what you're going to do for the United States of America. You have an opportunity there. Also, I would take the flack off of Trump, who's already under siege by the Biden administration. The two of you need to combine one way or another to get rid of Biden and the entire illegal regime that's up there doing these incredible things like destroying the border. So that needs to be absolutely crucial. And Biden's out there completely lying about his record and going after his political opponent in the New York trial and trying to get things through the Department of Justice. This has never been done in America before. So we have a sick political dynamic that's going on there. And
everything is sick in politics these days.
Well, it's really,
you have to ask yourself, where is the sanity? Where is the health? Where's the vibrancy? Which is what we're all craving.
I think what needs to happen is everything needs to be filtered through the Constitution. And this is really what we're missing with a lot of these candidates. But we're going to do special reports coming up on the election. I think the Kennedy point about John Kennedy is crucial, though, because he was there in the trenches talking to those people. It's something that Nixon would not have done, for example.
Okay, while you're drinking that, George Ivankovich wants to know, does James Churchward come into any of this with his book, Cosmic Forces of Mu, which I'm lucky to own?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I'll tell you, Churchward is someone that I read when I was very, very young, like 9 years old. And he's absolutely fascinating. His stories about going to these monasteries and finding they had all this information about Mu. So he's all about the Pacific Lost Continent. Now, they refer to it coming out of the mystery traditions, like the public ones, Theosophy and Anthroposophy. Lemuria becomes that title for Mu. Mu, meaning motherland and things of this nature, was a massive continent that went down in the Pacific, and their survivors went and built up a great civilization in the Gobi before it was a desert. And Casey has a really remarkable story about them. And he talks about the kind of advanced technology they would use and how they used audio for their own defense. So they had these sonic weapons.
That's cool.
Yeah, very interesting. He also talks about elevators and how there was a city of gold waiting there in the desert. So China has that to deal with. But there's a number of crossovers there because there's an expedition that the Gurdjieff work cites that Gurdjieff was a part of in the meetings with remarkable men about finding a city of gold in the desert, in the Gobi Desert, or searching for it. So this thing about the city of gold, I think, is very interesting. And in the Rata story, which is, Rata is this incredible priest who becomes the intermediary between the Egyptians and the Atlanteans coming in, and working with the Emilius group, bringing in the records, and Hermes, and all this kind of thing. But what's fascinating is Rata does this kind of world tour, and one of the places that he goes to is the Gobi, which is run by this character Mu, M-U, which is the same name as the mother continent. So he may have inherited the name as part of like a royal thing, but Casey describes him as having blue skin and 6 fingers. So we're looking at a different track of humanity.
What kind of time period is this?
Well, Rata is 10,500 BC.
Okay.
And so that is the whole thing about when the pyramids were done, when the Sphinx was done. But again, I do want to say this, that what I've always found the most fascinating when you get around the Giza Plateau aspect in the Casey readings is that he says in order to place the pyramids there, they go to Giza because it was the location earlier of a much older structure. So 10,500 BC, they're doing archaeology, and that's where they go. And at a different time, he talks about, and Steiner talks about, a temple of Isis being there, but it was flooded, and this is a long time ago. And then the flood recedes, and then they come back and build the pyramids there. Well, where's that? That might be like 50,000 BC, 100,000 BC. But how is a temple of Isis already there? That's something that seems to come up later. So this is very old. Apparently the stuff is much, much older. And of course, it's no surprise to people in this audience, but I'm talking a lot older. And I'll never forget my conversations with Michael Cremo in the way that he had dated things, and he had stuff in South Africa that went back to 1,000,000 BC. So, the dating gets very, very interesting. I know that Casey talked about paintings that a woman had made in caves in Nevada in 10 million BC. Well, we don't understand anything about that in the normal history. So there's something very, very unusual going on there. Then we also hear about this wave of humanity that's not quite physical yet in early Atlantis. So if you go even further back, who are you dealing with? You see there's some major questions that are hanging out there. And I have a few quotes on those from Steiner tonight. And Steiner also plays a role in the Hacking Atlantis documentary, the Craze and the HotZone that we just put out last week. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, Atlantean Anti-Gravity and Akashic Records. We're going to take your questions here momentarily. I'm going to read a couple of quotes before I go any further. You're up.
Nanette Chris said the Casey readings say that the entity is a group of souls with a corporate mission. What incarnates is an aspect. That is why Casey's spirit guides included Rata.
Well, I think that there's opinions about how that works. In the mystery traditions, reincarnation is pretty plainly laid out. You go through a series of incarnations. So, you can look at things through different lenses for sure, but it's kind of hard to get around the fact that reincarnation is a kind of a major revelation inside the mystery traditions. Now, what reincarnation means isn't what it devolved into in certain kind of Hindu traditions, which is, you reincarnate as an animal of some type.
Or a tree.
That's purely cosmology, mythology. But the idea of a person incarnating on a number in a number of different time periods, there's such a degree of science in the reincarnation from the mystery aspect, and it was considered very deeply in the mystery schools. Should we let this out? And we did the story recently, going into Allan Kardec and how he had let out a great deal of it in the 1850s, and that by the time you get to the Theosophical Society, at first it seems like she's tiptoeing around it, and then she goes full scale with it, because there was a lot of things there. It's crucial, I think, when they give us on the mystery side a number of different things. One of them is they give us the tradition around Atlantis. This is very interesting, right? They have a lot of other things they could give us, but Atlantis shows up dramatically as a point. Then the next thing that they do is they give us the whole thing about reincarnation. Well, these are cues, and they're kind of giving us information saying, you need to look into this. You need to recall, you need to kind of wake up and remember this. And especially in the arc of Casey's work and in Steiner's work, they say, well, a number of those souls are reincarnating who went through the same thing when they were in Atlantis. They went through the destruction. Some of them were involved with causing it or trying to prevent it. And they're coming back now. And at a certain point, he says, look, you can look around at World War II, look around at a lot of the leaders around the world today. They're all Atlanteans. And he calls the Atlanteans super sensible, which is very interesting, because if you go back and study them, they are a telepathic, psychically dynamic group, which seems distinct from every other group in their periods and then after the fact. So there's something very strange still, I would say, about our understanding about the Atlanteans. I do say, there was someone who was very interested in biblical interpretations around reincarnation. And, my thing is that reincarnation is a central piece inside the mystery school. There's no question about it. But it's, for if your own understanding doesn't get into reincarnation, then you're doing your own kind of interpretation of it. But I think it's, in the Steiner info, in theosophy, in anthroposophy, in Casey's work, the whole wide swath of it is reincarnation is a central piece, and it's important to get our heads wrapped around what that's all about, because there's also the thing about planetary sojourns, which is what happens when you leave Earth. You go to somewhere inside this system like Venus, and you take on the Venus body, and you go through what Casey described almost as kind of like schoolrooms, which I think is quite fascinating. Then you go to Saturn. It's a different type of thing, and Saturn, that whole ring around it. I remember the experience that Casey talks about, where he had the impression almost about like security guards along that ring, and how it was basically Saturn was this massive, security prison. So whether it's Mars or whether it's Uranus or all these different things, they represent progressions of consciousness. And then you come back here taking on. And this is the map of anthroposophy and Casey's work. One thing I think that's important also is it shows up often in Casey's work. I'd like to make a highlight of it, which is that Arcturus is talked about as the door out of the system. And I think that needs to be studied more. You see, I see all of the work on the mystery side as them leaving clues and them giving indications for. So you can follow up on this, you can follow up on that. We've left it out there for you. So they don't say, follow up on this Arcturus thing. It's the most important piece you're going to find, but they'll say Arcturus is the door out of the system. Well, that's a pretty big deal. And that gets us into the whole Pleiadian question as well.
We should really do an episode on the different planets being different systems, particularly Saturn.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And I'm going to read some of the quotes on this from Steiner about the planets, because I think it kind of fits right in here. I want to mention something. And did you say, so the last
there are
question,
lots of votes for yes, yes, yes on that one.
Oh, good. If if there's any, I think it's important to study Kardec's work. I'm starting to realize that if Kardec is bringing out early traditions, if he's in the 1850s, and if later Blavatsky is saying we're going to do something like the Kardec salons, but we'll do it in America, then she is kind of using that as a jump-off point. So, I think we need to understand Kardec better. And what's interesting is how powerful he became in South America, and why he was so widely adopted there. And, you find that Blavatsky and Steiner have great things to say. It's interesting if you crisscross who has good things to say about that. And I will say that in the Gurdjieff tradition, for example, Ouspensky uses recurrence. He doesn't refer to reincarnation. He uses recurrence, which is you end the life that you just had and you start it all over again. Exactly. That's where Groundhog Day comes from, Ouspensky's work. And you have a very thin chance, a very thin opportunity of changing things. And there it is again. But you might discover a way to change things. Okay. Here's a couple of quotes from Steiner that get us around this, but he's talking about Atlantis, and he says, the initiates in the schools during the time of Atlantis are indeed beyond the average development of their time. For admission into such schools, age is not the deciding factor, but rather the consideration whether the candidate in his former incarnations has acquired the ability to assimilate the higher wisdom. The confidence placed in initiates and their agents in Atlantean times was not based on the extent of their personal experience, but on the age of their wisdom. For an initiate, his own personality has ceased to have any importance. He's entirely at the service of eternal wisdom. Therefore, the characteristics of any period of time have no weight with him. Isn't that interesting? But he's saying that it was based for an initiate, they're using a different way of grading people. And so I take a lot from that. And when he's talking about how the Atlanteans used what they used basically for fuel for this Twoy purposes, he gives us a hint that has something to do with plants. You know, we remember Casey talking about, well, there's a star that's on fire, and it, you know, they take the input from the star and they use it for energy purposes through the crystal. Well, here's what Steiner is saying. In Atlantean times, plants were not cultivated merely for use as food, but also in order that the slumbering force in them might be rendered serviceable to their commerce and industry, just as we have contrived for transforming the latent force of coal into the power to propel our engines. So the Atlantean devices for heating by the use of plant seeds, in which the life force was changed into a power applicable to technical purposes. This is very interesting because, again, later there'll be this whole wave of ether force that comes up in the 19th century in John Keely's work, for example. And in the middle of that theosophical tradition, you'll see this huge flag waving for Keely and everything that he's doing. But then the idea that they need to kind of withdraw, that Keely's work can't survive in the kind of primitive atmosphere. It's too much technology, and the primitive minds would, you know, overwhelm, basically. The corporate world would, you know, take it on, and the war machine would take on Keely's heavy duty technology. Now, so he's talking about the life force in the plant seeds, and then he says, in this way were propelled the airships of the Atlanteans, which soared a little above the earth. These airships sailed at a height of that of the mountains. They had steering appliances by which they could be raised above these mountains. Now, Steiner's getting us into the advanced technology there. By the time you get to Casey, he's like, I'm going to tell you how these things could disappear and reappear and go through things and photograph at a distance and photograph through walls and all the rest. So, you know, Casey's really opening up, I think, that technological question. Here's another interesting point about Akashic Records. Look, all of these traditions use Akashic Records in order to get a handle on what happened before. So there's only so many records that we have. So we know, you know, in all kinds of psychic trance activity, all kinds of important information has come through, especially through the Casey work and others. We know that in the remote viewing program, I remember discussing with Russell Targ the kind of important information the government was getting using remote viewers. And, you know, Targ is impeccable with understanding the mystery schools, and he was impeccable with his work around remote viewing. You get the real hint of things from what he was doing. And they were getting absolutely actionable intelligence from using the psychic ability. So when we see that, when we think, okay, what is the Akashic record? It's kind of, it's hinted at, and it is, according to the mystery schools, it's the whole record in time and space of everything that's transpired, every thought, every historical incident, and all the rest of it. You remember the Star Trek episode with this, the Guardian of Forever, and they're watching everything take place there. Well, this is very much what it is. And so here's Steiner talking about it, trying to explain it and say, like, you know, here's how we can trust this kind of information. He says, it is, however, difficult to translate the inscriptions of the Akashic record into everyday language. It were easier to decipher the occult language of symbolical signs used in occult schools, but this is not yet permitted in our time. This is interesting, the permitted part about what the schools permit and what they don't permit, and gets, I believe, to the conversation around steganography. So there's a little hint there. And he says, the reader is therefore begged to give a hearing to much that may seem obscure and hard to understand, to make a valiant endeavor to grasp their meaning, as the author, on his part, has striven to devise a mode of interpretation capable of being understood by all. The trouble expended in mastering many a difficult passage will be rewarded by the insight gained in the profound mysteries, the momentous problems of humanity, herein revealed. These Akashic records, which for occult investigators are as much undeniable reality as mountains and rivers for the physical eye, constitute for man the basis of a true knowledge of self. An error of perception is, of course, as possible for the one as the other. And this is why occasionally you'll find two high-powered, sources of information giving slightly different interpretations of things because they're coming at it through a filter. But nonetheless, this process, which, people like Pythagoras and Plato and others could read these Akashic records, becomes an important part of how we see things. Now, what I find most fascinating is Casey talked about how the Akashic record, he was asked, could somebody make a device that would show the Akashic record? As he says, well, yes, absolutely. And as a matter of fact, they will. So have they already done it? Quite possibly. Yes, indeed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Atlantean Anti-Gravity and Akashic Records all around the Hacking Atlantis documentary that we put out last week with all of the Craze in the HotZone information down there in Bimini and Cuba. Let's take your questions now, and then we'll try to get through the rest of these quotes as well, and we'll roll it all in together.
Okay.
Miss Olivia, it's up to you.
Okay, David Tremina. DJ, do you suspect that the exotic weapons recently used against the U.S. intelligence agents in Cuba was an action taken by a secret group to block access to the sunken ruins?
Yeah, well, isn't it interesting that you have, first of all, an unknown technology in Havana syndrome? The most important thing about Havana syndrome, in my opinion, is that when those ambassadors and people and officials from the United States who went to Cuba after Obama reopened our embassy there in 2016, with very little fanfare, and I don't think they did it the right way. But as soon as they did it, these people would have these incredible, they thought were acoustic concussions, and they would send them back. But when they'd get back to a place like New York or DC, the symptoms and the syndrome would follow them. So it's something that's tracking them now. It's not something that was local to the area. I remember, the media made up stupid things like, oh, it was crickets. Yeah, mind control crickets. We have these very unexplainable things. Well, it's interesting that it came up around the HotZone, isn't it? Because again, you have all the unexplained aspects around the HotZone. Then you have these officials down there. They've broken through, the 60 some odd years of embargo there. And there they are, the first people installed. And what happens to them? Well, they're hit rather heavily with an unknown device of some sort. And, the CIA's own interpretation of it is they didn't know. It's an unknown. It's a question mark. Now, I'm sure they know a lot more than they're saying, of course, and they've used the same type of weapons. But it's quite possible that somebody, that they are not in cahoots with is using that. And I don't mean Russian or Israeli intelligence or anything. I mean a group that doesn't want them there in Cuba. So I'm partial to your question and the conclusion inherent inside thereof. Yes.
Space Ghost. There were news stories from the Australian government about Pine Gap at being at the forefront of anti-gravity tech in the 1950s. And just down the road from Pine Gap is Woomera, a pop-up town, all square with green buildings. Definitely aerospace.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. It's where they do a great deal of testing. And now I've done one of the episodes I did on Pine Gap was like the 5th episode of the X series. We just did one in November, which I think opened up a lot of this. But Pine Gap becomes like Autech, which we covered in the HotZone documentary, something that is completely, out there. You can kind of do anything that you want. You are the intel pirates of the sea. What can you not get away with in Autech? You could do anything you wanted to. You're outside of Andros Island, and you are doing underwater tests. Well, you're testing missiles and all these types of things. You can do anything you want. They could take a whole group of people, experiment on them, If they had this apotheum technology, they could test those people. Can they stand up against the apotheum effects and all the rest of it? Because there's such a heavy UFO signature at AUTEC as the underwater Area 51. So I think that areas, and something I've tried to put together is kind of like X geography, the HotZone, Pine Gap, because we've had a lot of fixation on Nevada, and I think that they've placed our attention in certain places for where things happen, but I don't think that the major things are going on in the places that the stories take us to. I think the HotZone and Antarctica and Pine Gap would constitute some of the most amazing and unusual. But I've pointed to a few places in North America that are never discussed in relation to them. One of them was Moon, Pennsylvania, because it was much more likely as an intel, site, a whole development as a kind of a cloaked Area 51. And we put a number of things on record about Moon. I'm sure there's great people up in Moon, Pennsylvania. So if you live there, I'm not saying anything bad about you. I just mean the infrastructure is heavy since World War II with secret projects. Yes.
Corky Goss, propulsion may be a better term than anti-gravity. Gravity is yet to be determined. Maddie Mosef says, DJ, what's the deal with spinning mercury? Rotten Cryptobit says mercury quicksilver was key to antique tech and free energy extraction. And Gold Pro says, has DJ any knowledge of the 5 inert gases being used to produce anti-gravity?
Well, this is interesting. Supposedly, T.T. Brown himself wasn't crazy about the phrase anti-gravity, and yet it's interesting too. In fact, they become anti-gravity devices. In Casey's work, he talks about the Atlanteans overcoming gravity itself. It's very clear from what he's putting across that this is the suggestion. But he also suggests that they could go anywhere in the universe. Well, that's pretty remarkable, but remember, when you talk about the Atlantean technology, Casey puts a lot of it on a psychic level so that they required a psychic ability in order to operate it. And so many of the Atlanteans sort of had it inherently. I'm going to read you a quote which ties a lot of this together. And there's a crucial aspect that I've tied in before having to do with Ezekiel, but really see how this plays out in the context of what we're talking about here. So Casey is saying, well, before this incarnation, we find the entity was in the Atlantean land. During those periods, particularly when there was the exodus from Atlantis owing to these activities, which were bringing about the destructive forces. These we find the entity was among those who were not only in what is known as the Yucatan land, but also in the Pyrenees and the Egyptian. For the manners of transportation, the manners of communication through the airships of that period were such as Ezekiel described at a much later date. Now, here's the Atlantean period he's talking about here. It's 10,500 BC. Ezekiel, somewhere 500 to 1,000 BC, technically. I actually think he goes back maybe more to like 3,000 BC, but the technical record that they go with. So if you have someone in 1,000 or 500 BC versus 10,500 BC, but they're observing the same craft that the Atlanteans were operating then, who kept it for 10,000 years in between? How is this guy getting a chance to see it 10,000 years later? Somebody had it. That's the conclusion that I get to from this particular reading. And, the whole flying wheels, living creatures, and all the rest of it doesn't take away from the mystical aspects of it. But if he's witnessing an Atlantean craft in the beginning there, the question opens up wide open. 10,000 years of technology. Somebody is operating very intense technology there that he's seeing. Now, Actually, before I do the rest of these, I'm going to go back to you for questions.
Hockey Goss says, spin is chi. God's toolbox may be in whirlwinds. And Rotten Cryptobit says, wheels within wheels, inertial damping.
Oh, no question. There's some secret in the whole idea around perpetual motion. And so much of this kind of takes us into different tracks of discovery. What I want to suggest is that when people get involved with the UFO file and the secrecy around it, that so much of that relates directly to the effects that take place around it. Remember in the Aztec crash, one of the things that grabbed my attention was that the scientists who were involved, they were not able to spend more than a half hour inside the craft before they would fall away sick, sometimes very, very ill. There was some effect that was taking place there. Another thing is that when they would go in, time would stop for them. There's a whole mass of missing time that's right in the core of the UFO file. And we don't hear, the UFO field has lost all focus around the very interesting effects that take place. They're so busy, sorting through CIA junk that we don't get around to that. What's interesting is if you go into the classic cases, you've got people floating, you've got time missing, you have all the traditional physics laws not operating. That's apotheum. And when you get into that apotheum stage, there's a technology there that they're so concerned about. And in my opinion, over those, 100 years or so, have not figured out how to aim without a boomerang effect of some sort. It seems to me that this is the nature of the secrecy, goes deep into this effect, which for them seems to go right to the heart of things, much more than, they're covering up aliens because they don't want us to know about that there are alien races. I don't think that requires the level of secrecy that they've given this. This is, remember that Sarbarker said it was on the highest level of United States security, far above the nuclear secrecy. Well, we do anything to protect our nuclear secrets. If this is above nuclear secrecy, that's where the whole X-Protect aspect comes in. Yes.
Joseph Tugas says rotation and counter-rotation is key. Giza Death Star community says Hoagland's 3 laws of hyperdimensional physics: rotation, rotation, and rotation.
Oh, yeah.
And Space Ghost says this is so cool. There was an ET encounter where you have to research this. 1910s Parramatta, Australia, local bridge builder was given a water torsion formula. On his deathbed, the constant formula was known and it clicked. His haunted cottage is still there. Very cool.
Oh, wow. Isn't that interesting? Well, it's funny because I remember in an interview I did with Dr. Farrell that he said, he had that great quote, which was that torsion physics made the atomic bomb look like a firecracker. This is important for us to understand that when they're dealing with this other technology, the X technology, as it were, because I've always, the way that I've presented it here is inside the UFO file is the X technology. Think of the whole Tesla aspect and what Tesla was trying to do. That whole aspect resides inside the UFO file. That's the level of secrecy that they keep it on. Everything is under this, the X technology's right in there. So on one hand, you get these incredible stories about what the government can do with their technology and all the rest of it. And then you get alien stories, UFOs and all the kind of incredible things. But really, what's interesting is the X technology has this apotheum effect. And, we've cataloged that X apotheum goes all the way back to the destruction of Atlantis and the Twoy stone. And that they kept the X steganography as this kind of warning throughout these generations, this signature about this. And that when it comes back up in this era, this is the wave of it, as it were, the UFO sightings have the same signature when they show up as the X technology. things don't operate the way that they should. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to who, when they have taken boats out around Bimini, their compasses spin backwards. There's an amazing account, and I spoke to his widow before she passed away, by Dr. David Zink. And he has two classic books, one from the 70s and one from 1991, all about Atlantis. And he's somebody who employed psychic archaeologists and all the rest. And he worked with Jacques Cousteau. And of course, Alexandra Cousteau is in our documentary because she was targeted by the Epstein-Maxwell gang, because they wanted all this information. She was an unusual person for them to be after, to blackmail. And when I dug into that a little bit deeply, I said, oh, the reason that they're blackmailing her is because of everything, the undersea world of Jacques Cousteau and all the incredible Atlantis discoveries that he had. This is something that the Epstein-Maxwell group really wanted their hands on. So I think, we start to get a handle on this aspect because, of course, when you get into the hot zone, you have tons of UFO activity. And in Bimini, they're so common, they call them fireflies. Well, it's interesting, isn't it, that, AUTEC, that Underwater Area 51, very clandestine group, the U.S. government doing this underwater test evaluation, that they're on Andros. And Andros is stone's throw from Bimini. They're right there. There's also things like the Andros platform and other strange, very unusual, a lot of unusual ruins around Andros underwater, the Shark Mound and things of this nature. So having AUTEC sit right there, it's kind of an uneasy feeling somehow. And is it ours or is it theirs? I'll never forget that very strange remote viewer, Joe McMonagle, very interesting guy, did a lot of work for the government, but certainly had the chops. And he tuned in. He did one of these remote viewings around this area of where AUTEC was, and he saw something that looked very much like one of those, the traditional gray alien. So, operating one of those ships underwater. So, Lord knows what we've got going on in that department. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is Atlantean Anti-Gravity and Akashic Records. We're going to take a couple more questions. I'm going to read a couple more quotes, and then we're going to wrap up tonight. It's all about hacking Atlantis, the Craze and the Hot Zone, and the work that we've tried to capture here about Poseidia Rising and the temple off of Bimini, which is one of the three places where the Atlanteans placed their pyramids or halls of record. As Casey said, one was under the Sphinx, one was off the coast of Bimini, which was Poseidia, and one was in the Yucatan. They all three contain the same information about the Atlanteans, including the Twoy stone information, which I guess in certain circles makes it highly dangerous and worth all of the geopolitical intrigues. I reinserted the name of Egerton Sykes in the documentary to try to make sure that he's in the realm of this, because he was the person who was a British intelligence officer. And when he retired, he took to publishing all this Atlantis material, had the largest Atlantis library, and had this Atlantis journal, which I was lucky enough to get all the copies of after his death, after tracking them down through a few different states. And they are quite interesting, but the most compelling aspect, I think, inside of his work is that the intelligence agencies all know about the massive ruins off of Cuba, and that there's a massive ISIS temple in the Bahamas. He would not give the location, but they're very aware of these things. And so the archaeology wars that are going on there, he's so matter of fact and glib about it. He's saying, look, China's involved, Venezuela's involved, Cuba's involved. There's tension with the United States over it. Look how many sanctions we still have on Cuba after we supposedly reunited and reopened our embassy and all the rest. So something very, very strange involved with it all, including if you go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis, That's very strange too. It doesn't add up as the normal pattern in history of the way we would understand it. So, given these connections that we've had and brought forward, I don't think it's too bold to say that the HotZones played a major role throughout the 20th century into the 21st century in our geopolitical landscape, all due to the fact of these Atlantean ruins down there and the knowledge of the intelligence agencies involved. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Joseph Tugas, when we die and see our whole life, like a life review, does it come from the Akashic Records? And George Ivankovich, if they built a machine to use the Akashic Records, could that be the reason for some weird Mandela effects?
Whoa. Well, you're thinking a lot like I think. This is interesting. I don't think I finished the T.T. Brown story. So he's at his private school there, and this orb shows up over the water, and then it comes at him at full speed and freaks his horse out, and he ends up flat on the ground, and he sees his whole life course. And then he builds something called the acoustic fan, which we feature in the documentary. It's very important information that his daughter gave to me about it. There's only one picture with him and the acoustic fan, and I put that in the documentary. Quite remarkable. Now, acoustic fan is a very strange trajectory. One, when he does the demonstration, he does it in the basement of the Rand Corporation. Two, Curtis LeMay is there. And she talks, T.T. Brown's daughter talked to me all about Curtis LeMay hanging close around T.T. Brown, keeping tabs on him. And, showing up as a friendly, but it's unusual. And I can also say this, that when there were projects that he didn't want to work on, he would retreat to Eleuthera Island in the HotZone, and she would say, we'd be surrounded by security personnel with machine guns, I mean, he knew basically that the X-Protect group, what they wanted him to do. And this is how he kind of maintained his safety and security. But in any case, at this point in the, I would say around 1967, I believe, when he gives the demonstration, he is there, and she is one of his assistants at this point. She's only 18 years old, and he has this other assistant as well. The other assistant is a young man, and they have a conversation at one point where he's talking to T.T. Brown, and T.T. Brown says, do you believe in time travel? And the guy says, yes. And he said, well, you're a smart young man. In our lifetimes, we'll see it. And he says, by the way, what would you do with it? And he said, I'd try to go back and save my sister who died when I was young. And T.T. Brown says, well, there's probably rules against that. You probably won't be able to do that. But, you're on the right track thinking we'll have the ability to travel in time. And so this is the hint that he's very confident in this time aspect. Now, when he does the demonstration, it's funny because his daughter told me he's drawing these X's on the ground and that he's telling her where to put the X's. That I, of course, am going into the X steganography bit, but it's for placement of things, supposedly. And so he gives the demonstration. LeMay is there. And the acoustic fan, what it's supposed to do is recreate what takes place with that happened to T.T. Brown when he was hit by the orb, to show you your entire life. Now, the other purpose that it has is whatever they play for you, symphonic music, speech, tones, whatever it happened to be, they will stay with you for a number of days, 3 days. So after you've gone and you've done all this, a couple of days later, you're still hearing what the acoustic fan gave you. Whatever was in the heart of that examination and demonstration, the acoustic fan disappeared from history. And almost immediately after, T.T. Brown takes his daughter, Linda, aside, and he says, I'm going to tell you something. You're going to go to Europe. You're going to have a nice, happy life. You're going to go to college over there forget all about the acoustic fan, forget we talked about it, forget about being my assistant and all this scientific work. You're going to be hunky-dory over in Europe. So whatever it was there that took place, they felt, oh, we're going to keep this completely under wraps. No one's ever going to hear about it. Well, there, you just heard about it. So there's something that took place there in the late 60s that changed our entire approach scientifically, militarily, and in other ways related to time, etc. So there's a lot there. And given the fact that T.T. Brown had been going to the western tip of Cuba for all those years, remember the San Antonio story, I think there's something powerful, because remember, everything started to happen for T.T. Brown when he went to Cuba and that massive earthquake happened. Then he's involved in seeing Alice in Wonderland. Then he's involved in that western tip of Cuba submersible and all the rest. It's definitely in the hot zone. And if you look at someone like T.T. Brown, it's quite fascinating, because here's a character that creates this huge interface. He's kind of like the interface between anti-gravity tech, the X technology, the hot zone activity, and the UFO file, because he starts NICAP, and he's so deep in the UFO world throughout the 1950s. And there in the middle of it is the story of the acoustic fan. Quite remarkable indeed. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, Atlantean Anti-Gravity and Akashic Records. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, but it keeps us in touch through what I have to say is massive, and I mean massive, censorship of the program and the work that we're doing here for you. That keeps you up to date on all the incredible interviews, X-Series episodes. You won't believe the X-Series episodes we have coming up for you, including a two-parter on Helena Blavatsky coming later this month. Absolutely fascinating. And events that we have coming up for you, and large announcements around this documentary series. So it's all there in the free newsletter. It takes just a few seconds for you to sign up at darkjournalist.com. Make sure you take a moment to do that. Before I go any further, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Jessica Rodriguez, how did the government know that Nikola Tesla died within minutes of his death? They were all in his hotel room, taking all of his top secrets, life work from his room. Were they watching him? So did he get killed by the government, or was he dying and they just happened to be ready and waiting to steal all of his research?
Wow. Yeah, well, you're on the right track there. I don't think the government killed him because I think they were absolutely fascinated with what he could do, what he would not do for them. And they were fascinated with all of his connections and kept incredible tabs on him in a highly illegal, unethical fashion. But the personnel that they send in, it's very interesting, because when they send in our friend Professor John Trump from MIT, they're sending in at the request of Vannevar Bush, who's the top man in the UFO file. So he knows Trump can be trusted, and he knows that Trump has the high-level information. As a matter of fact, he is Vannevar Bush's protege. But when he gets there, he finds this guy who identifies himself as the hotel manager, scrambling to let him in and all this stuff later. And he realizes that those are intelligence agents pretending to be hotel managers and stuff. So the whole thing was very carefully conducted and choreographed. And he also said, I think the crucial aspect that he did put on the record, and he put it on the record with Stan Deyo, who gets incredible credit for actually interviewing him before he passed away and asking him a direct question on this. This is very interesting. He says, what the FBI was particularly interested in was information about taking down, quote, flying objects at a distance. If you put unidentified in front of that, then you have, the whole UFO aspect there. But taking down flying objects at a distance is what they sent him in there to find, along with information about the death ray. This is the thing that he brings out himself. This is what he actually says about it. When he gives a terse report 3 days later, it sounds very much like a government cover story. And we know that there are trunks that disappeared in relation to Tesla's work that his family searched for years. And I think that archive over where he grew up is still looking, the family is still looking for the government accountability on this. And I think the official government response came back in the 80s saying, oh, whatever we had was destroyed. So there's something very unusual about it. And if you look at the play of what takes place there and the fact that John Trump is sitting in the middle of it, you're going to find an answer and a solution to why there's so much acrimony in relation to President Trump. Because we've had people who were lightning rods in the political arena before, from Nixon to Bush and others. There's something quite unusual about the way the deep state reacts to Trump, and an aspect concerns directly this UFO file technology. I have no doubt about it. And I think his development of the Space Force is that key opening to the whole thing. And of course, Tesla, Trump, and the time capsule is one of the crucial episodes of the X series that we did. And with that, Miss Olivia, you're up next.
Okay, Bino Sarazi says, do all these abilities of time traveling, accessing the Akasha Chronicles, etc., have two paths, an inner meditative esoteric path and a technological exoteric path? Neil Lemuria says, it's linked to spiritual technology, inward reflection, and soul development, I believe. Happy Hermit 3D says, the dark side seems to have a problem with creativity. They have to steal it from us. And then Neil Lemuria again says, were the sons of Belial the fallen aspect like we have now in 2024?
Oh, there's no question that, the whole Belial aspect is back. If you hear the description from Casey on what they want to do, it's all might makes right. They want to use this, the spiritual technology that the Amelia's group uses to contact the outer spheres in the saintly realm. This is the way that Casey describes it. Look, Casey was not doing the Atlantis part in a fly-by-night fashion. Casey gave 900 readings on Atlantis over a 30-year period. This is a lot of deep information relating directly to these groups. And his story of Atlantis is the Amelia's group on one hand and the Sons of Belial on the other. And what happens, he does describe a kind of cosmic entanglement, the way you were mentioning, this kind of ethereal thing going on between them, which is that the Belial group imitates what the Amelia's group does. So they imitate them. That's how they arrive at the technology. And Steiner corroborates Casey here, if you look for it, because what he says is, people were initiated who shouldn't have been allowed into the Amelia's group. And Casey, sometimes when he's taking people back through these previous lives, he'll say, well, you were part of the Amelia's group that fell in love with someone who was from the Belial group. And it caused, a lot of problems for you in that lifetime. So there's a whole, kind of interpenetrability of these groups. And this is part of I think the very deep aspect that's going on there. There was a quote dealing with the whole double sex and unisex aspect that all of the mystery schools go through, the androgyne piece, which I think is important. I'm going to read a couple of these quotes and then we'll take your last couple of questions.
Sure.
Everyone, you're watching Atlantean Anti-Gravity. This is a special Dark Journalist episode for you, and it's all based around our new documentary, Hacking Atlantis, the Craze in the HotZone, with all the figures there in the intrigue in the HotZone between Bimini, Miami, Cuba, and the Yucatan Peninsula and all the ruins associated there. We're taking your questions now. I'm going to read you a couple of quotes. We'll take a couple more, and then we'll wrap up our special report. But it's great to have all of you here, and thank you very much for the incredible response around the documentary, which we have a documentary series coming for you, but this one is very important, I think. And we had a great crew working on it, and to everyone who helped us with it, absolutely remarkable. The team, Sam Kruger and his incredible crew, and the kind of research that we had going into that is just phenomenal. It's all there for you. And it's Kelsey Forrest who helped us with the interviews there. Just absolutely incredible work. And we hope to get a lot more out for you about that. Okay. Here's the Akashic Record thing around single sex, unisex, androgyne piece that I think is important, that Steiner gets at. Casey gets to it. What are they talking about? So here's what Steiner has to say. When we study the Akashic Record, we see that for a period in the far past, human forms appear soft, plastic, quite unlike those of later times. They still retain in equal measure the nature of man and woman. As time passes and matter densifies, the human body appears in two forms, one of which resembles man's later form, the other woman's. Before the appearance of these differentiated forms, every human being could bring out of itself another. The fructification, before the appearance of these differentiated forms, every human being could bring out of itself another. The fructification was no outer process, but one which took place within the human body itself. When the body took on a male or a female form, it lost the possibility of self-fructification. It no longer could reproduce on its own. Cooperation with another body was necessary in order to produce a new human being. The separation of the sexes appears when the earth attains a certain condition of density. The density of matter partly checks the power of reproduction, and that portion of the reproductive force which is still effective requires completion from the outside by the opposite force in another human being. So what happens here, which is interesting, is Steiner is saying it's a development piece. In Casey's work, it's the Amelia's group that brings it about. So this is also interesting as well. Later, you're going to find, with all the scientific activity, and we brought Marvin Minsky into the documentary. Marvin Minsky is the creator of AI. If you want to know about AI, you have to go right there to Minsky. Well, Minsky was involved in the HotZone through the daughter of Colonel Sanders, Margaret Sanders. And we discovered this and put it on the record. But Margaret Sanders was one of the top people investigating the ruins in Bimini and working with the Casey Foundation. At the same time, she was going to the Nixon White House, having all these deep conversations. She had an ongoing relationship with Albert Einstein. This woman was very dialed in. But one of the fascinating things about Minsky is the degree to which the Epstein-Maxwell group targeted him for information. Well, certainly, as the creator of AI, they would have a lot to go after him on. And what's interesting is how I brought this about. I got a tremendous break through the testimony of Virginia Giuffre in her case against Prince Andrew. One of the people she brings up remarkably is Alexandra Cousteau, I covered earlier, who's the granddaughter of Jacques Cousteau. But the other person she brings up that they say, she was under orders to go meet him at a hotel and do all the salacious things, and they would record it and all the rest, was Marvin Minsky. So they wanted this kind of blackmail, sex blackmail on Marvin Minsky. And you have to think why. Well, when you learn that not only is he the founder of AI, but he's the one who is best friends with Margaret Sanders, who is doing all this incredible research at Bimini, then it gets to what Epstein and Maxwell were doing there in the HotZone with people like Stephen Hawking, for example. A lot of the unexplained pieces come together when you plug in this piece, which is missing, that we put on the record with the HotZone documentary. And when I went into it, I started finding all these pictures over there at MIT of Marvin Minsky and Jeffrey Epstein. And Epstein's got his little Harvard sweatshirt on. Well, I'll tell you, we're about 5 minutes from Harvard here. And Epstein was the kind of guy who would just be walking around here and going to cafes. He would slip in and slip out doing his little missions. But there he is working to get Minsky involved. So all of a sudden, we start to understand the level on which some of this stuff operates. And I think that gives us a hint, shall we say. The other thing, that's a shot of Alexandra Cousteau as well. And she runs an ocean nonprofit. And of course, we know that was one of Gillian's covers as well. But I think that, Alexandra Cousteau actually is dedicated to this because of her grandfather's work and all the rest. I just think that they were trying to blackmail her for her grandfather's information. And
wow,
it's a stunning blockbuster of information when you get down to it. I mean, hacking Atlantis is exactly what they were up to, and then we're hacking into the program around the Craze and the HotZone. So this is where it stands. Yes, Miss
okay,
Olivia.
this is great. So New says, and Minsky was also at CERN. And Ratboy Genius says Marvin Minsky was known to draw sigils on the floor around his computers and do rituals to get his software to run.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating? He is a very unusual character, and the occult piece is riding shotgun right there. I wanted to do one final thing on, let's see if I have time to get this in. What I'll tell you, I'll summarize it basically, and we'll get around back to it with Steiner. But Steiner mentioned that there was another group that was evolving previous to humanity on Earth. And he's not referring to animals. So this got me, it's almost like an orphan quote, but it got me thinking a little bit more in relation to some of those very, very strange stories. And of course, a lot of them go into the UFO lore aspect, but that we brought forward around the Cosmos Club and the strange story of Charles Hall and the Tall Whites and the unusual things that played out there. And this group there that's hanging out, and supposedly, they're telling him, we're from this star system or whatever, but basically they're living there at the military headquarters, and they've got certainly high tech and an unusual appearance, but are they actually aliens? This, I think, may be something that we can open up with Steiner's question in the future. And I want to point out something as a clarification as well, which is I put on the record that there was an emblem, a copper plate found in 1894 by CIB Moore, Clarence Bloomfield Moore. And I put this on the record in an early X-Series episode. And I followed Bloomfield Moore because his mother was a great patron of Keeley and Tesla. And I still remember lugging the incredibly heavy book into work every day, East Florida Expeditions of Clarence Bloomfield Moore. And and Olivia can tell you that I looked high and low for this thing. And the emblem that I believe is the emblem of the Twoy stone, which is later adopted by a native Mayan group that goes into the American Southwest, is this, which was found. That's the copper plate found by CIB Moore in 1894. Now, I believe that CIB Moore discovered, and it's on record that he discovered some other things related to mound builders. But I think that he found even more related to the Twoy stone. I think this is the emblem of the power station of the Twoy stone. And I think the fact that they've discovered replicas of this in places like Alabama, which, Casey indicated after the group of Atlanteans went into the Mayan place, some of them broke off and went and became the mound builders, that this is an aspect of the story that's crucial. I do see people running around with the whole thing around the emblem and, kind of working it into different narratives or whatever. I just want to say that in all the work that I've ever done, I had, no one's ever shown me that thing has never come up anywhere at all in any book anywhere until we brought it out through the work of Clarence Bloomfield Moore, who gets the credit for it. And so we put that completely on the record with the Two Eyes Stone aspect. The other thing, the kind of whirlwind that the symbol goes through being out on the internet, I just want to say that this is something, again, that the X series does, which is when we find these things, we put them forward and we have tied them into a particular line of research. That's where we're coming from with it. And in the case of that emblem, I think it's a very powerful symbol of the Two Eyes Stone. And you get some hint there of the Atlantean aspect coming into America. And just for fun, of course, the Gibo rune, which it's X. And what the Gibo aspect means is gift. Well, the X is certainly a gift of sorts. The Lady of Elcha, who we focused on, this is something, they find various versions of her, but I tie it directly into that Atlantean tradition with the headdress. And of course, there's a heavy feature in the documentary on the Pura-Reis map as well, which is quite obviously a satellite shot from above. But of course, the problem is it's 1502. And the map maker, basically got it from a monastery who probably had it since before the time of Christ. So try and explain that one. The only other thing I want to put in here at the end is the Mayan Sphinx. This is important. In an episode that we did last year, it's called Pawgate. And it's a two-parter, but this is very important research that's going to come to more fruition in the future. But Pawgate takes us into the symbol of the paw as the mystery group that was holding the Atlantean records. And there's a whole story about the Yucatan Sphinx that Augustus Le Plongeon found. And there is the only picture of it before it disappeared. But I believe that the Yucatan Sphinx was the symbol of the Hall of Records. And I also think that the third place, that Poseidon Temple off of Bimini, is going to have a Sphinx. And that this is the signature of that Atlantean group hiding the temple records from Atlantis. And which Casey said, well, it's beneath, the entrance is beneath the right paw of the Sphinx. But he also said some interesting things. He was like, as the line of light falls between the paw, so there's something very unusual about it all. At other times, he would say, yes, the entrance is at the paw, but the pyramid of mystery that the Atlanteans placed that had the two-eye information in it and everything else is between them, the Sphinx and the river. So somewhere between the Sphinx and the river is this other Hall of Records, and the opening is under the right paw of the Sphinx. This is all included in the documentary, but this is the crucial aspect I think that Casey was trying to get across. And with that, Miss Olivia, will take your last question.
Okay, Najat Madri. In Atlantean times, the ether allowed for advanced tech to work. Today's ether is completely different. So what is it that they are really looking for, given that the atmosphere is so different?
Well, you also see them making changes to that atmosphere.
That's true.
Blocking out the sun. No, they can recreate all kinds of conditions. And no, you have to maybe read around some of that in the Steiner literature. I think in some ways he doesn't want it to become a treasure hunting quest as well. But I think that given the positions of the Earth, that when things go underground, like they do in 10,500 BC, what do? We bury the Hall of Records. So the Atlanteans are like, whew. And it's funny because I was going to bring up a character tonight. His name is Hept Supt, and he's in the Casey readings. And he's a very unusual figure that Casey describes as gold. And he has a very unusual history. But he's working with Rata, bringing from Poseidia. And remember, Poseidia is the Bimini area. And that's where the last kind of holdout of the Emilius group was, as the Belial group was attacking them. And they are bringing, under this war conditions and the earth destruction conditions, they're bringing all this stuff to the 3 different places. And Hepsupt, when they asked him for an interpretation of the name, it means help to keep shut. So this is the person who helps to keep shut the Atlantean technology because of the apotheum effects and the old kind of worldwide destruction and maybe complete destruction of the spiritual, physical, evolutionary path of Earth in that period. They needed to lock this stuff up. And this mirrors other stories that we hear about very ancient technology being buried and things of this nature. But I think the Hepsupt and some of these characters that Casey brings out deserve a deeper look in relation to this. And so I do think it's interesting. Certainly, they do refer a lot to that period of the Atlanteans being different in terms of density. And I think it is an important consideration. I remember a weird reading in Casey's work where he said the average ancient Egyptian was aware of things going on 8 miles above them. What aspect of the brain is
your
that?
pineal would have to be fully activated, that's for sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think the Atlanteans' direct influences, they're kind of this super psychic group. And I don't think there's that many of them. That's the other weird thing. So when they come in to Egypt, the way that Casey describes it, they come in with a bunch of these automatons, and the automatons do all the work for them, but they are created creatures. They're kind of like human animal cyborgs. And part of what Rata does is he sets out the Atlanteans, when they come into Egypt, the problem, as Casey describes it, is they start treating the Egyptians like slaves because they're so much more advanced. And this is obviously the Belial group kind of just becoming the dominant group. And the other problem is they have all these things with them. And the things can, do all this work, and they're artisans, they're construction workers, whatever. So the automatons are a very important, weird chapter in the Casey work about Atlantean science and the misuse of the science, the kind of, when he talks about Frankenstein monstrosities and things of this nature. But he's using this term automaton, which I think is the best he can do for cyborg in the period of time. And, in the last episode we did on the 8th Sphere, this whole thing about the Terminator, I mean, that's what it makes me think of for sure. Last question, Miss Olivia.
I'm linking these two.
Okay.
So Thomas Ball says they want to summon Cyber Satan. And then what? And Najat Madri, I actually think, answers it. She says, is the real question that the real battle is the war for our minds because our minds are the final frontier? Isn't that it? Is that as mind controlled as we are not 100% under control, for sure. As a species, we're kind of, and they address this in Star Trek, right? About how much the human being wants freedom and is uncontrollable, even when given, they don't want a prison, right? When they're given a pleasant prison, because we value independence and freedom so much.
That has to be the cage.
Yes, it is.
Oh my God. Yeah, that's I can tell you this, that I think that the from Terminator to Star Trek, there's a heavy, to Twin Peaks, there's heavy mystery school influence in the writing. And I can pick it out in certain things, and it's quite remarkable. What I do want to say is you're absolutely right. What happens is, this is why Neuralink is so dangerous, is so the body's the temple. We understand this through any kind of spiritual tradition, tree of life tradition, Hermeticism, whatever it happens to be. So to the degree that they can get inside the temple, They're dealing with more than just your physical output. And so therein lies the danger, as it were. Now, when we, kind of look out at these individuals who are trying to do this, they are some of the most powerful people in the world. They're very aware. And this is the next level of information that they want. Remember, data is the new oil and all that. So they wanted all this information about how we were so they could train AI and all the rest of it. And they literally, as science fiction is sounding as it is, they're building a clone army of, these robots and things. How far, before they mix in all of the human aspects that they've stolen from hospitals and everything else. So, in my opinion, they are building a gigantic clone army. I don't think there's any doubt about it. The thing is, the aspects that they need, the next level of the aspects that they need, have to do with something that in esoteric literature is called the silver cord. And that is the link between the pituitary, pineal, and Leydig glands in the body. And it's often called the Appian Way. And I will tell you what's really funny is, here in Harvard, there's a little lane. It's called the Appian Way, and I often see it when I'm around. So, this is kind of funny. This is a little indication, a little hearkening back. But if we do a little research on that Appian Way silver cord aspect, we'll get a lot of answers about Neuralink and some of the other things that they're trying to do with VR. And otherwise, I'm going to close with a quote on Hatshepsut. And I think we'll get into him more. We ran out of time in this episode for it, but I think he is important. And so here he is coming back and getting this reading from Casey. And Casey's going back through his lives, and he arrives at Atlantis. And he says, in Atlantis, we find the entity as were those periods before the destruction, when there was being continually waged war, what may be termed war. The brother, the neighbor, the associate, or as would be termed, he was as part of an evangelistic campaign, yet the works materially going about much in the general way and manner. This was war between the followers of the patriarchs of old, of Alta, which is the biggest city on Poseidia, which is Bimini, what's left of it, of Quoauda, Quoauda. You don't hear that too often.
Nope.
This is an unusual one. And those that directed against the sons of Belial. The entity was among those that were active as to the exchange of associates with those of the Poseidian land in the city of Alta, and as there is the entering of the priest Rata from the land of Egypt to Poseidia. So now we have this Emilius priest coming out of Egypt and going to Poseidia, bringing back the Hall of Records, creating the pyramid structure and all the rest in Casey's story here. So he's bringing it to Egypt to Poseidia that there might be gained more of an understanding of the law of one, that there might be the interpretation and the records of same carried to the Egyptian land. The entity returned or journey soon after Rata's return from Atlantis to Egypt. Hence, there was the continued rebellious exodus of the peoples in Atlantis before the final destruction. This entity, Hatshepsut, becoming interested in those activities, finally, as would be termed in the present, becoming embroiled through the engrossment of the events taking place in Egypt. And then what happens is he becomes the major one to secure the Hall of Records there in the temple, which has the entrance beneath the Sphinx. That whole story is sitting there in the Casey records. And this Hatshepsut helping to keep it shut, as it were, locking it up for the ages because of the incredible apotheum destruction qualities of this Atlantean technology crystal. The mighty, terrible crystal, as Casey would sometimes refer to it as. And it's interesting, if you go through Ezekiel and read Ezekiel, you're going to see this term, terrible, mighty crystal. So there's some crisscross in there with Casey and these biblical texts. And with that, Miss
Okay.
Olivia, I can tell you this, it's all so much of this and more is there in the Hacking Atlantis documentary. We have it there for you. So yes.
Okay, I just want to end on this. Ratboy Genius shared, I think genetic injections are developing to turn raw humans into clone mimics. Why breed clones when it's cheaper to turn naturally born humans into clone analogs? But I think the clone thing, I mean, obviously what we were talking about before, don't want us connected to God, to source. The best way to have a slave race
Yes.
that is not connected to source is to have them be the source, which is to clone people.
True. And I think there are fundamental issues with it because, you're going to have a soulless entity.
Precisely.
Yeah.
A planet of soulless clones.
And the question is, was it all done before in a little area down there in the hot zone? I wanted to show this. Maybe we can close out on this. Just for those of you who think, well, that Edgar Casey, the establishment doesn't care much about him. Washington Post, 2017. The psychic and the solar eclipse. Edgar Casey's grave lies in the path of totality of the eclipse. Washington Post. Why is the Washington Post even concerned? And who is it messaging here that Casey's grave is in the path of the eclipse of 2017? Well, we've seen our own eclipse here in 2024, but I think that's very interesting to keep in mind. And with that, Miss Olivia,
okay,
we are done.
I have a bunch of super chats to thank. Okay. Hold on one second. Okay, Eurythmy is fun. Alex Kritikos, Robert Scott, Thomas Ball, Stacy Chuli, The Bikini Truther, Weekend at Bernie's, Christopher Lombardo, Fulcanelli, Terry Doherty, Robert Hawes, Milo and SRQ, Lindy T, Happy Hermit 3D, Infinitum Neo, Jessica Rodriguez, YouTuber 427, and Jennifer and Bucks. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Fantastic. We appreciate your support. And of course, to all our supporters and subscribers, we couldn't do the work that we do without you. It makes all the difference. And, we definitely appreciate your support and need it more than ever for the kind of projects that we have lined up, coming up for you. Absolutely powerful work and dynamic events as well. Of course, a shot there of the hot zone. And I'll do a few shout outs here as we close out the program. Let's see what we got. Great ideas from tonight. And I thanked all you guys in the ideas room.
Can I ask you a separate question?
Yes.
Okay, so I didn't get to this, but Glenn Maxwell was suggesting an episode on George Hunt Williamson, but you did an episode with George Hunt Williamson, didn't you?
I did, but you can always go deeper with him, and I appreciate the suggestion. And there's actually some interesting books dealing with some of the issues from an X point of view on George Hunt Williamson. So we definitely will do that. It's great to see Najat out there, Golden Girl. They were watching Edgar Casey like a hawk. Casey was right at the epicenter of all that is y'all. Hey, listen, I have the CIA record of when they sent agents in there to the ARE in 1964, finding information on the Hall of Records. Unbelievable. Short Order Cook. The greatest gift we have is our soul. Boy, is that right on. Let's see. Hat Power, Golden Girl, Alchemy by Angels, Sun Hero, Marvin, Brad Briggs, Johann Wolf. Absolutely amazing. And like I said, I thanked all you guys in the documentary credits. And Scarlet Fire, great to have you out there. I did also link the documentary in the description of this video, so it's very easy for you guys to get at. And Thomas Ball, my mind is my church. Well, mind is the builder, said Casey. And thoughts are things. I think that's all really hardcore information. Brenda Fisher, outstanding show. Thank you. It's great to have you here with us. Spread the word on the Hacking Atlantis documentary because all the real core ideas are right there with us. And Sun Hero, let's see. Amazing show as always. Thank you very much. Who else we got here? Rebel Alliance. Thank you, sir. Wow, incredible. Nina says, Johann Wolf, congratulations, Miss Olivia. Nicely done.
Thank you. It's good to be
Excellent.
back.
You did a great job. And of course, to everyone who worked on the documentary as well as watching tonight, thank you very much. You did a fantastic job. And let's see, who else we got out here? Darla Catch. Excellent. Let's see. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you. Edgar Casey says Vixtech. Exactly. The Sleeping Prophet, the Sleeping Wonder, and really apparently a great guy. So that's kind of crucial, and a very humble person, which, you know, you see more and more rare every day. Everybody's running around talking about how right they are. I just want to get to the truth. Let's see here. Best wishes to all. Joseph Chugas. I know Joseph was out there. It's great to see you. Happy Hermit. Olivia's a guardian angel, says Happy Hermit. Let's see. Aware and awake, y'all. I like that. Ideas Room. Best of the interwebs. Exactly. Wow, fantastic. We will see you all next week. We have a lot of exciting episodes coming up. I mentioned the two-parter on Blavatsky coming up. Very exciting interviews for you, and the documentary just hit. So more and more coming, and it's great to have so many of you here tonight. Remember, it says end broadcast, but after all,
never really is. I want to throw something out there.
Sure.
Is that there's a whole playlist if people are interested in the HotZone.
Yes.
With how many episodes?
Oh, forget it. Like 20 at least.
So if anybody wants to go deeper,
it's in the description of the documentary, the entire list to it, or it's just on the front of the YouTube page. But if you do Dark Journalist HotZone, you'll definitely run across it. And that river runs deep, let me tell you. Or that Caribbean runs deep, however you want to think about it. And, you know, after all, never let it be forgot, once there was a Camelot. And it could be again. We will see you all next week, and have a fantastic night, everyone, and a wonderful weekend. Lots of wild things going on, but we'll be keeping an eye on it with special reports.
Stay centered.
Special reports, as it were. Thank you, everyone, and see you soon.
God bless.